Cunningham, working in the Astro department. Cut another video. I think it's my first video of 2022. Cheers! Woo! Fireworks for me. Okay, so just want to do a quick review of how to do a box problem, which is just the same kind of box problem that you would have if you were given a list of 6 COEs, which is kind of nice and tidy. But what if you're given something that looks a little more messy? Isn't really necessarily, but you just got to figure out how to do it. You're given an R vector and a V vector and an E vector, and then asked to cross out boxes? Question mark? I am your Sherpa. That's what I'm here to help you with. So here is one of those example problems here. Of course, you're given an R vector, and a V vector and an E vector stacked on top of each other. So let's see what we can do with that and start being, hey, can we starting? Can we start crossing boxes off that are not true and filling in boxes that are true? That's always our game here with box problems. So, alrighty. What I like to do is just basically start with the first box and work my way as far as I can down for what that's worth. This is my approach. So what do we have here? An R vector that puts us in a certain place, a V vector that puts us in a certain place, and an E vector. Remember, it's helpful to remember where these things point. So the R vector points towards spacecraft's location. Oh boy. This points towards spacecraft's direction of motion. Oh, we're going to zoom in. There we go. Direction of motion. Cool. And E vector points towards Perigee, remember. Just out in space, the location of Perigee within the orbit. Okay, now, when we talk about just E without a vector hat on it, what we're talking about is eccentricity. And remember, if we had an eccentricity of 0, then we have a circle. And if we have, this is just kind of a review, but if we have an E that's anywhere between 0 and 1, we have an ellipse, not including 0 and 1. So, put another way, for the eccentricity vector, no, that's not an arrow. That's not an arrow. That's an arrow. It's not a knife. Okay. So the E vector would have to have a 0 in this place and this place and this place to have an eccentricity of 0. So what I'm trying to get at is our first box asks us if we have a circular orbit. Well, I have 0i and 0j, but I have point something something blah 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 k, which means not perfectly circular. Bye-bye. Okay. Let's see what else we can tell. I'm going to go to the picture from here on out. All right. So here's how I do this. Now, I added a little earth here just to kind of give us a little extra context as I'm teaching it to you. You won't have an earth on the GR, but I just want to use it to kind of give some sense of perspective as I'm kind of teaching this concept. So here's what you would do. Draw your I vector. Boop. Draw your J vector. Boop. And of course, draw your K vector coming out the top. Oh, I'm trying really hard to be straight line. Okay. Boop. So making the boops is optional, but I recommend it because Astro is fun. So, all right, we got our I, our J, and our K. I'll zoom out a little bit. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw my R vector, give myself a sense of where the heck my satellite actually is. What should I use? I use yellow. Remember, R vector points towards the satellite's location. So it says we have nothing in the I hat direction, basically 0 I hat, and we have nothing in the J hat direction, 0 J hat, and we have our position basically is all K hat, unadulterated, pure K hat. So here I go. Drawing R vector. Okay. Gonna label it because I'm a label monster. I like labeling. Helps keep straight. Helps keep everything straight. So there's R vector. Now remember, what's at the end of this? What is at the very end of the R vector? Well, it's my satellite. I'm gonna draw my best satellite. That's a pretty good satellite. It's got little solar wings on it, solar panels, solar wings. Oh man, solar panels. Okay, now let's draw the v-vector. Drew the r vector pointing towards where the satellite is. Let's draw the v-vector, which starts in the satellite and tells us which way the satellite is going. Oh, okay, well, it says our motion, so our v-vector, our motion is all, let's see, j hat it looks like. So there's no I hat and no k hat. Well, that is very nice, I have to say. Because what that means is starting at the satellite itself and going all positive j hat, we're going to draw our velocity vector here. Oh, iPad does it for you. Very cool. Again, going to label. Okay. So just kind of getting ourselves set up here. We drew ijk. I drew my r vector with respect to the little ijk axis that I drew. And then I drew the v vector with respect to the satellite. Now, ooh, let's do purple. Yeah, or magenta, or fuchsia, or whatever. Correct me in the comments. Let's see. So eccentricity vector points towards, what is it again? Points towards perigee. And our eccentricity vector has basically no I hat component, it says. Yep. No j hat component. J hat component. It's also all in the positive k direction. So what does that mean? Well, it's pointing basically at the exact same place that r vector is. There's my e vector. So what that's telling us, and I'm just going to make a dot here in a label, tells us that perigee is right there at the end of this little arrow, this purple arrow, aka the eccentricity vector, and our satellite's right on top of that. So we kind of have a complete picture here. Let's start marking off things that we know to be true versus untrue. Okay, equatorial. Well, I can kind of tell this is not an equatorial orbit because the only way I'd have an equatorial orbit is if I was basically hanging out around the equator all the time. And my satellite is way up here at the, North Pole-ish location. At least we know it's very much not on the equator, so we can cross that out. Bi-equatorial. Prograde versus retrograde versus polar. Okay, so now we have to kind of look into our picture. We have a position that is 100% k hat. It's all positive k hat. All right. All the other orbits in the entire world will have some kind of I hat component and j hat component that's not zero, right? Most orbits have a little I, a little j, a little negative k, a little positive j, a little negative I. Any variation except for 0, 0, and something in the k. What this indicates to us is that our spacecraft is right on the North Pole because k hat goes up through the North Pole and down through the South Pole. Remember that negative k hat also counts as k hat. But our satellite happens to be right, literally touching k hat, flying above the North Pole. So while we're at it, we may as well mark that, I guess, eh? And the only kind of orbit that can fly over the North Pole and touch k hat is called a polar orbit. Now, if we had a list of 6 COEs, we'd know, just looking at inclination, we'd say, oh, if inclination's 90, I've got a perfectly polar orbit. We don't have that luxury here, though, unfortunately. So we've got to use our picture. The only kind of orbit that could have 0 here and 0 here, and then something non-zero in the k hat direction is a polar orbit. And you can see it on the picture. That's why we draw the picture for ourselves. Sucker's floating right on top of k hat at this exact snapshot in time. So when you have a polar orbit, it automatically means it can't be prograde and it can't be retrograde, because remember, for prograde, inclination needs to be between 0 and 90, not including 90. And if you wanted retrograde, inclination would have to be between 90 and 180, not including 90. Okay, but when you're pegged out exactly at 90, that's polar, and it's a very special case. It's exactly 90. Okay, now let's keep crossing off boxes here. So this is the spacecraft at the North Pole. We decided yes, it is. Is it a polar orbit? Well, that's the only kind of orbit that can give me flying over the North Pole. Now, I'm currently located, right? See, my little green spacecraft is right here, and he's flying over the North Pole. I can't also be at the South Pole at the same time. Like, can't be in two places at once as far as north versus south. So we can go ahead and get rid of South Pole. Now let's see. I hat axis, J hat axis, K hat axis. Let's see. The satellite's definitely not down here anywhere. It's definitely not over here anywhere. So that kind of rules out I and J. As we kind of talked about, you guys know, spoiler alert probably, it's floating on the K hat axis. So we fill that box in. It's literally right now on K hat. And we showed it's not on I, it's not on J, because otherwise it would be down here or down here, and it's not. It's not on the equator. It's up above the poles. Okay, nodes. Let's look at if we're at the ascending node or descending node. Let's see if we can rule that out. Now, imagine, if you will, the equatorial plane. See if I can see how good of a picture I can do here. Basically, all this, the equatorial plane, perpendicular to K hat and basically in line, parallel with I hat and J hat. Equatorial plane. Yeah, this is the challenge of drawing something 3D on something 2D. So I'll erase that. But I guess what I'm trying to say is we would have to be down here somewhere, around here somewhere, basically on the equator somewhere to be at a node. Because what's a node? Well, ascending node and descending node are the two places where your satellite actually flies over the equator for a split second in time. I hat and J hat are trapped in the equatorial plane, meaning there's a kind of a family relationship between those two. If we're not at a node, we can't be at I hat or J hat axis. We have to be on the equator at one of those nodes, and coincidentally, one of those nodes may be on I hat or J hat. That's where things get a little trippy. But here's what I'm trying to say. We're flying above the North Pole right now. We could not be farther from the equator. So we know we're not on a node. Okay. Good old process of elimination. Okay, perigee versus apogee. That's our last thing to look at here. And then we can be done. Okay, so remembering that the eccentricity vector points towards what? Well, it points towards perigee. And I so proudly made my perigee label here. Eccentricity vector happens to be 0, 0, and something positive, just like our vector. Meaning, a spacecraft right now is not only on top of K hat, it's also directly on top of perigee. I kind of mentioned that earlier, but I want to reiterate. So that just makes this go super fast. We are literally on top of perigee right meow. And if we're at perigee, I couldn't also be at apogee, which is down here, right on the opposite side of the orbit. Mutually exclusive, right? So I get to cross that out. So what then? In the end, we determined it's a polar orbit. The satellite is at the North Pole at the moment, which if you're at the North Pole, that also triggers your on K hat axis. And due to our eccentricity vector, we found out we're at perigee. And that's it. That's all we can tell, but we addressed all the boxes and we either filled them in if they're true or crossed them out if they're false. And that was the mission. So mission accomplished. Okay. Next problem. Okay. So what we have here, let's start this problem the same way we did the last one. Did I use red for my axis? Yes, I did. I'll just do that here as well. Hat. J hat. And, oh gosh. I don't like it. I could do better. But not that much better. Okay, that's better. Got my IJ and my K, my little Earth there. Now, we don't have quite the same situation we had before. The R vector, which I used yellow for, will keep consistent. R vector is something positive in the X hat, or sorry, positive in the I hat, and something positive in the K hat, and then nothing in the J. So what does that look like when we draw it out? So lots of positive, lots of positive I hat. Okay, and then also lots of positive K hat. Okay. So the two components that make up our R hat are those that I drew in the dotted line. And R vector itself is going to reach out to the very end of that. And we've got kind of pointing out of the board at us partially, or pointing out of the screen at us, is our R hat vector. Let's check out, let's draw the satellite on top of that so we know where we are. It's pretty dope solar panels. Oh man, one's huge, one's smaller. Okay. Our V vector says, okay, nothing in the I, nothing in the K, and it's all J. Okay. All positive J. Okie dokie. I'm going to draw my velocity vector going all positive J. Ooh, that's cool. Label that velocity vector. All right, so what this means is our satellite's up off I hat axis somewhat because we have some positive K, and it's out along I hat axis somewhat because we have some positive I. And at the moment, our satellite is going completely eastward, basically totally towards J, totally positive eastward. Positive J meaning to the east. Okay, with respect to I hat anyway. And then our last mission, just like before, is draw the eccentricity vector. All right, here's where my drawing skills get challenged to the max, trying to draw 3D on 2D. The eccentricity vector looks like it's basically the evil twin, the mirror universe component of R. R had some positive I, it's a positive K. Well, eccentricity is all negative I and negative K and 0 J. So basically everything that R is, E is the opposite. So let's see, we have negative I, which would take us this way, right? Negative I hat would be out this direction, if you could see through the earth. And some negative K. So let's see. Here's K hat axis. So our eccentricity vector is pointing somewhere down this direction. Not somewhere down. It's pointing exactly opposite of R vector. So I'll label that. Okay, so what does E vector point at? Well, E vector points at Perigee, just like before, which gives me kind of an early hint at some of these boxes, right? So like my spacecraft is absolutely not on Perigee. It couldn't be farther away. It's literally actually on the other side of Perigee. Up here. Meaning, since it's specifically at the most opposite point of Perigee, because remember, R was positive I, positive K, E is negative I, negative K in equal measure. That's important, equal measure. Then I know I'm at Perigee. Or sorry, I know I'm not at Perigee. I'm at, forgive me. I'm at Apogee, and I want to cross out Perigee. How do I know that again? Well, E vector points towards Perigee. Perigee's down in the southern hemisphere somewhere. And currently our satellite is at the most opposite place from Perigee, which is called Apogee. And so in the spirit of labeling, I will do that. Okay, labeling everything we've done so far. Oh, we kind of got an early box out of the way. All right, now let's start moving through just top to bottom like we did before. Do we have a circular orbit? Well, okay. To have a circular orbit, I would need nothing in I, nothing in J, nothing in K. When I say nothing, I mean 0 exactly. Now we have two non-zero values for eccentricity. So, busted. We know, here, actually I just want to cross out the whole thing. We know we're not circular. Okay. Are we equatorial? Well, remember, the only way we could have an equatorial orbit is if we were basically hanging out on the equator the whole time, and our satellite is up here. So that's not right. Bye-bye, equatorial. Prograde. Okay. Now, the Earth rotates to the east at 15 degrees per hour. This will come in handy in a later lesson. But what we can tell is that our v vector, basically if I transport it down here, shares that same eastward direction as the Earth. So orbits that share that eastward direction, at least partially or completely with the Earth, are called prograde. Again, if we had a list of 6 COEs, we could just read the inclination directly off, but we don't have that luxury. But since our V shares that eastward rotation of the Earth, we get to call it prograde, which means it is not retrograde and it is not polar. How do I know it's not polar? Well, remember, if we have a prograde orbit, that means some element of that orbit's rotation shares the Earth's eastward rotation. With a polar orbit, you're coming directly over the poles, and basically no element of your orbit shares the Earth's eastward rotation. So basically, if it's prograde, it cannot be retrograde or polar. Okay. Are we at the North or South Pole? No, we know what that looks like. The spacecraft have to be up here or down here. My spacecrafts get worse the more I draw them. But right now, that's not true. It's not at the North Pole or the South Pole. It's flying somewhere off in the Netherlands. I don't know. Not the actual Netherlands. Okay. Axes, let's see. Are we on I hat? We would have to be along here somewhere. No, we're not there. Are we on, or negative I hat? Are we on J hat? No. Are we on negative J hat? No. Okay. Cross those out. What about K? No, we know what that looks like. Again, we're looking at the poles here, and our satellite's not down here, and it's not up here. That was last problem. So right now, it's not on any of the axes, and it doesn't have to be. That's okay. Okay, we're almost done. Are we with the ascending node or the descending node? Well, remember, to be at the ascending node or descending node, those are the points where we're crossing the equator, whether we're going from south to north, which is ascending node, or north to south, which is descending node. Right now, as you guys can see, like I'm partway towards positive I hat and partly flying up in the middle of nowhere with some positive K hat. So I'm not on a pole, I'm not on an axis, I'm not on a node. This satellite is a rebel without a cause, and it's just flying in the middle of whatever it wants. But for us, that means goodbye, ascending node, and goodbye, descending node. So what do we know from this painful experience, or fun experience, I think? This fun experience has told us that we have a prograde orbit. Yep, it's going the same direction as the Earth, to the east. At least part of it is. And our spacecraft at this moment is on the opposite side of Perigee, which is Apogee. And everything else is not true. Again, it's kind of a rebellious little satellite in this orbit that doesn't really fit most of the, what its mom and dad said it should be as an orbit. It's like, no way, mom and dad, I'm going to be a different kind of orbit. All right, but either way, that's how you take R and V, and make a box problem happen. A little bit of art goes a long way, and if you have a whiz wheel, so much the better, but I personally am somebody who just likes to draw it out, so hopefully this helps, and we'll catch you guys next time.